culture, or as it's put in German, Kultur ist einfach, culture is easy. Well, what we've learned in this project, and that anyone who's done work with culture has certainly learned, is that border culture is not simple, but it is a no-brainer. And in a sense, it is a part of everything. It needs to be included in our considerations of the border. The border culture is becoming more complex in globalization, but its multi-scalar and multi-dimensional change is enabling us to look in the interstices and to get a better sense of what's actually happening. So that cultural shell is actually being pierced. It's being opened up so that we can understand it more effectively in globalization. I don't want to spend a lot of time providing you with context here, but I do want to make a number of very critical points. The culture that we produce originates in geographical spaces and also transcends them, meeting and crossing at borders. Culture is something to preserve and cling onto in the face of expanding flows of people, ideas, goods, and capital. And this precise interplay of border and culture, how borders alter culture and how culture alters borders, is central to any investigation of borders in globalization. What we need to do is we need to fill this picture. This is a cultural artifact at the border, but as you can see, it's empty. There's a frame there, and what we need to do is to try to fill that frame. I've been thinking about these kinds of issues for a long time, and I'm not going to spend too much time discussing where border culture resides, but it's really important to recognize that affinity, identity, imagination are all very important components here. And the crucible in which these are linked to each other is a very important aspect of our study of borders and culture. But what is border culture? After working on this for a number of years, we are coming to an understanding that border culture emerges at the intersection of cultural meaning. Human beings build themselves into the world by creating meaning. Culture gives meaning to action by situating underlying states in an interpretive system, and part of this cultural meaning relates to and activates the boundaries of being. And border culture is this part of meaning. Now, I could spend a lot more time talking about this. It is filled with a number of important questions, but let me proceed and explore some of this in greater detail. Now, I'm not going to talk about thinking about border culture. This is essentially the literature review. It emphasizes a number of important points that we've come to connect with in our studies. But suffice it to say that if you would like to have a little bit more detail in this, I'd be most happy to share it with you. Our theories of culture and border are grounded in the essentialist view of culture, and they're caught in the territorial trap. So this is where this territorial, aterritorial context comes into being. Culture is viewed as a bounded system contained in defined territory. It's always been that way. Culture is expected to be homogeneous. It isn't, but it's expected to be. Culture is shared by members of society, and this territory-oriented rhetoric of culture, border, and boundary faces a great challenge in a multicultural society because intense contacts between various cultural carriers blur the clarity of the demarcation lines. And border culture then is no longer culture at the margins, but rather culture at the heart of geopolitics, of flows and the experience of the transnational world. So it may be situated away from the border, in world cities, in airports, in detention centers, in immigrant enclaves. It may be at once a manifestation and an imaginary. It is integral component of borders in motion, and it's experienced by more people in more circumstances than ever before. Those are some of the important findings that we have made. Now, in terms of theorizing border culture, which is a very difficult thing to do, I must add, we've come up with a number of planes. Now, these are not periods of understanding. They don't necessarily follow each other in time and space, but they are all planes of understanding that we have come to, and they roughly are in chronological order. The sense of confluence, that border culture entails relating the international forces operating between nations to transnational forces produced by the presence of one nation within another. And I could go on and explain a number of these things, but I just want to draw your attention to the last point here, and that is a point that was made by a number of anthropologists several decades ago now, and that is that liminal and third spaces do not revert into previous forms. So border culture keeps moving on, evolves, but it doesn't revert into previous situations. So there's this plane of confluence. Another plane is of differentiation. We have a number of theorists that have done a lot of thinking about this, and I could again go into considerable detail here, but one of the things that's really important to note here, again, is the last point, and that is that there has become, in globalization, a differentiation of belongers. And that is an important takeaway in this point. Another plane is the plane of moving beyond binaries. And this is, again, due to the fact that we're moving away from one state, one territory, and one society, one culture conceptualizations, and we're moving into other ways of thinking. First of all, with hybridity, then more into looking at border culture as complex, intertwined processes, and then looking at this privileged locus of hope, space of crossroads, new ground for securing relationships, a place for celebrating difference. So we've moved beyond the binaries of the previous stages in development here. But what we find now is that perhaps the plane that is most useful for us in understanding border culture and theorizing about it is the plane of shifting interfaces. And this takes into effect the concept of motion. It takes into effect the concept of borders and controls, Uri's Risk Society, the work that's been done on borderscapes, borderities. There's a whole series of other things that are part of this. One of our graduate students at Carleton has been working on this concept of line dancing and the border as being a game, and has come up with some very, very interesting perspectives with that. You'll hear her paper tomorrow. So culture gives meaning to action through interpretive systems, and the meaning of culture at the border is then the major question that we're looking at. So, toward a theory of border and culture, we're not there, but there are a number of components that are accumulating to help us move in that direction. That is imaginaries, production, identity, control, resistance, and those are the major components. Now, just to end up, what I'd like to do is just to take this back to the Borders and Globalization project and give you a sense of how we're putting this all together in a volume that has just recently been completed. It's going to go to our publishers relatively soon. And this has three major components in it: viewing border culture, borders and culture in motion, placing and replacing border culture. And here you just have a quick overview of the components of that with the various chapters. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but I invite you to discuss this with me afterwards. Borders and Culture in Motion, the various chapters related to that, and then finally placing and replacing border culture. So, in conclusion, what we have is a world in which border culture has very highly variable results. Culture is constructed both within and across boundaries. Culture precedes borders, and consequently there's a certain amount of stitching that occurs. But what we're seeing is a very important aspect of the relationship between international forces operating within nations and transnational forces produced by one nation within another to capture both these imagined and material qualities of border culture. And finally, that symbolic power resonates very effectively in culture. So culture is a good barometer of the way in which power is exercised in borders. Thank you for your patience.